Well, good afternoon and evening to everybody. Thank you for taking some time tonight. I'm glad that you're going to continue to be on here, even though you couldn't, maybe God couldn't make it last week. I'm really excited to be, working with you as a community and working in this process for Atlanta Public Schools. Let me introduce kind of myself about who I am. My name is Tracy Richter. I'm Vice President of Planning for HPM. I've been doing this work for about 25 years now. Before this, was actually a middle school teacher before I started this work, a lifetime ago, but have had the opportunity to work across this country, in what I've calculated to be about 28 states and in, districts of all sizes. Certainly the size of Atlanta. I've worked in places like Philadelphia and Chicago and DC and Austin, Texas, and but that's only to say that I've got some background and experience in doing this work. But I'm really super excited to be working in Atlanta, and with APS and with this community. So what I'm going to take you through tonight is the kind of the process overview, and I'm going to take you through some data. There is a lot tonight. When in our first meeting with the task force, we kind of described it as kind of a sit and get and kind of understand the process and understand some data. And then we had an opportunity with that group to go through some challenges and opportunities that each of the cluster faces, and we have that all recorded. And as we move forward in this, really making sure that we work with this task force to help us guide this process. But I'm going to take you through a PowerPoint. We're going to talk about kind of roles and responsibilities in the process. And so I think what we'll do is like, if you have questions as we go through or something like that, you can probably just put it in the chat and we can go back and we'll kind of capture it all, and then we'll answer some questions at the end and kind of anything you might have at the end of this. So bear with me while I kind of pull up this presentation, and let me get it into mode where I can present it for you. Okay. Just a nod, Kavi, if you can see that, make sure we got it. Excellent. Okay. Okay. So, as we walk through this, the agenda that we walk through is really about, the process and data and the educational framework and parameters discussion, which is probably the primary discussion that we have up front is around the framework and parameters of planning that we want to do. And so as we go through this, one of the first things we talked about was really about guidelines, for the task force. And this is why I'm so glad that you're all here tonight to kind of make up and are still, part of this process, because it's going to be really important to attend the task force meetings. I know the schedules and conflicts get in the way. We are also trying to schedule, just so you know, follow-ups with smaller clusters within the task force. And so we've sent out, and you may have seen something from Travis on a survey to pick out good dates where we can come, and we're just going to meet in smaller clusters for a longer period of time to really start to roll up our sleeves and talk about this. So that's the first one. The other thing is we want you to be open to all possibilities in this. There is a lot of potential for moving forward and how facilities can support APS communities and students and staff. So we want to make sure we're open to all that. Actively recruit citizens to attend those larger community meetings or to fill out surveys. There's currently a survey out, as many of you may know. We had our first community meeting, and we had an online virtual meeting yesterday. We had about 160 people show up. Unfortunately, we didn't have a big crowd last night, and that's okay. But we do have a survey out. And so one of the roles of the task force is really to, as we're going through this process, we will communicate to you often. We want to make sure that you're communicating out to all of your community and your friends and your neighbors and your schools, and your Go teams and all those. We want you to review data and be prepared as we go into meetings. We're going to make sure that we get you data early in meetings, and any data that we can get that you might request that you want to see, we're going to try to get that as early as possible. We think it's really important that we don't use a media or social platform for personal agenda. This task force is really about how we are working together to build toward a really great facilities plan to support Atlanta Public Schools communities and students. And so, again, there's one thing in a plan like this is that we don't always come to the same conclusion or the same kind of agreement at the end, but we want to make sure that the process and the data work together. And so this is just really important to work together on this. And we're going to try and we're going to work our tail off to make sure that we are doing our best to serve you as a community as we come in to help you with this facilities process. When we get to community meetings, if you can attend them, we'd love for you to help us kind of facilitate those meetings. Talk to community members, help us work through questions and do that. We want you to still obviously bring some objectivity to this, and we want you to, even though you are representing clusters in schools, we also have to work toward a district perspective. And so we love the idea that you are representing your school and you're representing that cluster and you bring that perspective. And we should all be vying for schools, but working together to make sure that we're working in one direction will be really important. And then obviously we want to be able to communicate those outcomes, communicate the work and the outcomes to the community. And so those are some of the roles out there. We're going to work really hard toward as much transparency as we can get. The role of the task force is really to work with us on process oversight. And process oversight could mean, hey, we really need to work, toward this community, or this community is going to need some attention, or can we go out and meet with this community? Or it can be, hey, do we need more meetings, or do we need another report out there, or something like that? Helping us do that is really important. To look through the data and review the data. Look, we've been through about 2.5 months now of a lot of data that you're going to see tonight. And we work our best to make sure it's as accurate as possible. But we want to make sure that the data is understood and that it is not being kind of misinterpreted. And it's not my role to interpret data for you. It's my role is to look at the data and how it informs the process and how we make decisions. But I want to make sure that we're hearing from you about the perception of some of that data out there. Like if we're saying something or data is being out there and it can be perceived in a different way, we want to know that. Because I know that data can be perceived in a lot of different ways. And I don't want the data to come across as something that we push out on people. I want to make sure that everybody's seeing that data for what it is. To help in our options development, I think this is going to be, as we work through this process and get to a stage of developing scenarios for the challenges and opportunities around facilities for each of the clusters and working toward a district-wide plan, helping us develop those and working with us to help us develop those. So we're using the data and the community kind of vision to help us develop the pathways to get to a comprehensive facilities plan. Again, we've talked about community facilitators, but also recommendations review. When we get to that recommendation stage, helping us review those recommendations, making sure that these are good long-term recommendations that are well vetted out. The GO team members and representatives are on their public meetings. Again, those public meetings are really the first meeting that we had is really around educational framework, and we'll understand more of that in a minute. But to get input on those options and scenarios that we develop together and those recommendations also. We're trying to get all the community members out we can. And when we get into this process, you're going to see some dates out there. But understand those dates are kind of placeholders for weeks, because we know through this process that we're not going to be able to identify right up front what exactly, which communities we might have to do deeper dives into. And we're going to be willing to do that and make sure that if we have to go into a little deeper dive into a cluster or community with the community process, we will. And so we don't have all those identified yet because we don't have a plan yet. And so that's going to be out there. And of course, the Board of Education, and, as they look at policy oversight, they ultimately have the approval of the recommendations that go out there. But that'll be very visual and very out in front. All the business meetings that we go to and the workshops that we'll go to. So a lot of public kind of transparency on this. Now, what is a facilities plan? And I think that, when we talk about facilities planning and how we've developed plans is that, I use the analogy of this four-legged stool across the country because I think it's pretty easy to understand. Is that if you've got facilities that kind of sit on top, and they're the facilities are the top bench that it sits on. It sits on four legs that all demand attention when it comes to decisions when it comes to facilities. I work with districts who will put out requests for help on, they want to do a demographic study. Well, then they think their demographic study is going to inform everything they need to know about facilities. and demographics isn't, it's just one piece. But demographics and enrollment don't just mean a number out there. They don't just mean a projection out there. There really is taking a look at, what's in the numbers, the types of students who we're serving, what programs they're served in, how that's distributed through the district. And so we look a lot at those demographics and enrollment. Certainly we do look at projections, but the demographics also, we look at housing, we look at birth data, we look at historical enrollment, we look at, kind of what's going on in those neighborhoods. And so because we know that's important. The second piece is condition, the condition of facilities, not only, and we talk about condition in two ways. We talk about the physical condition, and we're going to talk a lot, that's going to be part of this tonight. But the other thing we talk about is the kind of what we call the adequacy of a facility or the suitability of a facility and how it supports programs in buildings, everywhere from the general classroom to STEM labs to the theater to art rooms to the athletic fields. How are those facilities supporting the programs that are in schools? And so there's two components of that. What I think is a cornerstone of planning is the educational framework, is understanding what the goals of the operations of the district are from a delivering of education model. And this can be anything from grade configuration to school size to class size, to all those kind of things that make up how school is delivered. And not only that, but it also talks about specific programs, anywhere again from core education to exceptional education and special needs students to multilingual services to career and technical education to early childhood education to the fine arts to athletics. All of those things are part of what makes up a school district. Now that is the cornerstone of good planning. That's what shapes facilities. That's what forms facilities. Facilities are kind of that after discussion about what we decided the framework should be. And finally, the last leg of that stool is the funding component, about how you prioritize those dollars to make sure that those dollars are being used effectively, and how those, from an operational standpoint, how those dollars are being directed more to the classroom, to the student, to the student, to the student. And so when we look at this, the facilities plan is a short and long-term vision. And so the plan is to develop a long-range vision of what this school district can look like in 10 and 15 years from a facility standpoint. But what it's not an East Boston planning exercise. Not yet, it's not. And the reason for that, and I've been sharing this with everybody we've talked to, is that what's great about the state of Georgia is this East BLOS funding, that the ability to help school districts with infrastructure and continuous infrastructure improvement is a wonderful thing. But what has also happened in the state of Georgia across the state is that facility plans end up just planning to the SPLOST. They don't oftentimes go to the bigger vision about where this district's going to be post SPLOST. And so what we need to do is we need to focus on how this district's going to look and how the comprehensive plan informs the SPLOST, and how we prioritize those SPLOST projects as we move into the several SPLOST programs. And so we do want to make sure that it does align to the strategic plan. And so I think this is kind of an overview of what a long-range facilities plan should encompass. One of the things we look at is portfolio facilities. And, again, what I want to share with you is that it's not just necessarily the age of the building, because the age of the building oftentimes doesn't necessarily determine what the long-term disposition is. I look at the age of facilities from a standpoint of how buildings have been built over the last century. When you look at schools from the 1920s and 30s, they're built much different from those rapid built schools in the 50s and 60s that were reacting to larger enrollments and larger birth status in that kind of baby boom generation. And then as we moved into the 70s and you see these open concept schools and no walls in the buildings, and then you move into the 90s where you get these kind of more pod schools, even into today in the more flexible schools. And so oftentimes when you're looking at the age of facilities and campus age of facilities, it's really about how those buildings can support programs of today and of the future that weren't built in an era to adapt to that. And so that has influence on how we make decisions. Certainly, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, certainly this district has a vested interest in protecting legacy and historical, the nature of facilities and buildings across the city. And so we do pay attention to that, definitely. The demographics, I'm not expecting you to kind of read this chart, but one of the first baselines is understanding the birth data and how the birth rates are impacting it and how the birth rates are impacting, Atlanta public schools. Now, again, from a national standpoint, birth rates are down and they're down everywhere. And it's impacting education across the board. And not just public schools, but the charter schools and private schools are feeling the decline of birth data of that entering kindergarten and first grade from lower birth rates that have been declining for several years. Now, how we collect birth data is we are able to collect the birth data actually by boundaries. Now, birth data is matched to mother address, just so you know. So they're matched to that mother address or last known address we know there's some transients that happens in homelessness that goes on too. But those birth rates are calculated. What they'll do is that we use those birth rates to calculate what a progression ratio is for how many students are born here versus how many kids show up in kindergarten and first grade. And so as you can see from 2011 all the way to 23, that birth rates have declined. The number of births have declined by about 800 students, or I'm sorry, 800 births over the last 10 years. And so if you can imagine that if a district holds its progression ratio, let's just say that a district captures 70% of students that are born here. So built, and that's not a one-to-one because there are students that certainly move away after they're born, and there's certain students that move in after they're born too. But if that ratio, that capture ratio is 70%, and it remains 70%, 800 kids less means there's going to be less kids in the district, regardless of, if there's less, or that just the number calculates to 70% of 800 less. And so you can see that immediately has an impact on what the projection of a projection will do. And one thing I should have mentioned, there's a State of the Schools report that you can access online, and I've noted on each page where you can find these in the State of the Schools report. And so you can find those and you can follow, and all this data is in there. That's why I'm not going to go like by cell here. So as we look at that even further, we know that the overall decline in enrollment, the overall APS decline has been, pretty steady. And not big overall from that standpoint. But what we're seeing is that the biggest decline that's occurring is starting to happen at the elementary grade level. And I'm going to show you some charts on that. So if we look at the historical enrollment for all students, this includes charter students that are in the APS system. If you look across the board, what you can see is that look at this, the 0 means kindergarten here. And again, sometimes the numbers are important, but really we color code this to see that the bigger numbers are in red and the lower numbers are in blue. And if we look over the last 10 years, you can see, let's just look at 17, 18 or 16, 17, which was the highest entry year of kindergarten in the last 10 years. Almost 4,800 kids were in kindergarten that showed up in kindergarten. And if you move out now to this year's data, it shows that there are 3,700 students that have now come in and now are kindergartners. And so in the last 10 years, we have just, in those 10 years, less than 10 years, we have seen 1,000 less kindergartners that are in APS public schools, or in APS public and APS charter schools. If I look at it without charter, kind of the same trend. In 16, 17, it was 3960, and you can see that the kindergarten enrollment now is 2925. Now imagine, as they progress through the district, that you can see that there is obviously going to be less students, even if the progression ratio stays the same. And so it's hard, even with housing, and this is where I'll go with this, is that as you look at the projection, we know this growth, and we know that there are parts in the district that are growing, and we know that there's parts that are growing downward. But also, what's kind of fascinating about what's happening in today's world in demographics is that even with housing growth, and there has been housing growth around everywhere, and even with the mayor's, what I feel is a really aggressive plan, a great plan for affordable housing in Atlanta public in the Atlanta city, is that affordable housing is going to be important to maintain an enrollment. We all know that there's gentrification that's been happening in neighborhoods, but there's also been reinvestments where we see young families coming in. One that comes to mind, right away is like the Beltline. You're seeing a lot of young families come into that area because they are being able to come in at probably a little lower price point that they can afford to come in, but it's still pretty expensive to move in if you ask people from the Beltline. And as these start to, as you know, areas of the sea starts to improve, we're going to see some of that going on. But even with, if we think about like a student yield for a household, typically what you're going to see a pretty strong yield for a household in an area would be 0.3 elementary kids in a household. Now, if you think about that, with 1,000 less kindergartners that are coming in at a 0.3 ratio, we'd have to have 3,000 homes get built to make up for the 1,000 lost kids. And so remember, there's a debit and credit side of this that happens. And so although we do show kind of a forecasted enrollment out there, what I do want to share with you is that, like, I feel like, and I've been doing this a while, that I feel like a 5-year projection is typically pretty solid. After 5 years, the numbers kind of get wary, because at that point you're projecting birth data and you're projecting more housing that you don't really see coming on the books, and there's some unknowns out there. But the 5-year, you have really strong data to really get to that number that you need to get to. And so also just making sure that we align those K-12 feeder patterns and keeping those in line. Now, as we look at projecting enrollment, again, for all students, we see that there's going to be continue in the next 5 years, kind of that still there's some decline out there. And again, in the next 5 years, it's not too dramatic. I mean, it's a couple thousand as we go through, but not bad for having so few kids coming into the district from that birth data. But again, over the next, we do anticipate that there's going to be some drop out there, and you can see a lot of it, these red numbers start to turn blue very quickly as you progress through the district. And so, I think this is important to look at. I think the other thing is that we're going to look at enrollment at several times during the year. We always look at the October count and the March count to see what the kind of movement is. We know one of the big challenges in APS is transients, and those in real hyper poverty and transients. And how do you work that in kind of a projection in a system, and by cluster? And so we have to pay close attention to that as we move through this. So as we project the enrollment, this is kind of gives you a map of, kind of where we anticipate the most and the least growth or decline. But what we want you to everybody know is that we actually do projections based on where students live, not where they attend. And I'll show you why in a minute, because I'm going to show you something called a live attend analysis. But the reason we do that is because we have really solid data about where students live. And, again, even when we've got the homelessness, and we can track that by where they are, where they check in and where they attend sometimes. But where they live, and we can project where they live. And so even if we, like in the future, if boundaries have to be moved, or if feeder patterns change, or whatever has to happen, we can still project based on where students live, because that is constant, even though boundaries aren't. The other thing is that to project enrollment by school becomes complicated and not necessarily based on demographic factors. There are several factors that can mean a school's enrollment will change. So for instance, the district is going through, the school going through a boundary change next year. Well, that will automatically throw off an enrollment projection. You change a grade configuration, it throws off the projection. Sometimes you move a program out of a building and you move it somewhere else, that'll change a projection. And so we geocode those kids, and we've got about 15 years of geocoded students. We look at those progression ratios out there. We look at housing development and permits out there. But we also know what impacts, kind of the opposite negative impacts of enrollment happen too. And so we're trying to project as best we can. Our projections are fairly, and I don't say they're fairly accurate. I say our projections are really accurate. And they align to the trends of the district's been doing for the last several years to validate that. And so the next thing we talk about is the capacity of schools. Now, again, capacity, if I could share with you one of the most debated topics in educational planning that I've faced in the last 10 years, is really about capacity. Is really how many students can a school hold? And so the other thing, and here's the thing, and the problem with capacity is that there's about 1,000 ways to calculate capacity, because I've seen about 1,000 ways to calculate capacity. But what happens in capacity is really about how buildings get kind of get used in there. And I'm going to explain that in a minute. But how we're calculating capacity is that, for the past, I don't know, 15 or 20 years, the state of Georgia has determined capacity by what they call instructional units, instructional unit allocations. And what they do is they give a medium, high, and low range for the high, medium, and low range for instructional units in a building, what that means to capacity. And what it's proven to be is pretty accurate. And the reason for that, it allows for some utilization factors in a building that get accounted for. And so I'll explain that in a minute. But basically, how we've defined capacity in here is the mid range for the instructional unit allocation from the state of Georgia. And that details that capacity. Now, here's the thing, is the most important thing to remember about capacity, regardless of how it gets calculated, is that the capacity of a building is fluid. And the reason the capacity of the building is fluid is because program drives capacity oftentimes. And let me give you the easiest example that I think I can give is that, let's say you have a general classroom at the elementary grade level that, by the district standards, or let's just say that it holds 22 kids according to district standard, 22 kids in that classroom. Well, next year you have to use that classroom for a special ed unit because you have an increase in special ed needs, and exceptional education needs. And that capacity of that room goes from 22 to 10 to 12. And so the capacity of the building then just gets reduced by 8 to 10 seats because of that program move. And so that's what happens in school buildings. And so there's fluctuations of how that works, and it does also work differently from elementary to middle to high. But all that being said, that what we do know is that, and when you look at the district as a whole, that there are about just under 20,000 seats in the district that aren't being utilized. Some more at certain levels and some less at other levels. And again, this doesn't mean, people in parts of this district, well, they're not dealing with that. They're dealing with overutilization of facilities. But other parts of the district are working with underutilization of facilities. Now, when I get to this utilization discussion, I think this is the important thing to remember, is that we are driving this plan to make sure that all schools are programmatically viable, from a general core instruction to specialized instruction to fine arts instruction to physical education instruction, and to media services, to nursing services, to guidance services. And to be programmatically viable, there has to be a certain enough enrollment that comes into buildings that allows that staffing to occur. Now, and so for me, utilization at the school level doesn't necessarily drive a decision, because if I have, let's say, for instance, an elementary school that has, let's say, 550 kids in it, which is a programmatically strong building. You can get enough FTEs to staff a building of 550, but they were put in an old middle school that might have had 1,000 seats. I'm not sure I mind that building has all those empty seats because it's a programmatically strong building. But the problem is that when you get 10 of those, and all of a sudden then you have 5,000 empty seats, that's when it starts to become an issue overall. Now, again, in APS, this kind of varies as you move across the district. And the idea isn't to make the district so we don't have any empty seats. There always has to be flexibility for those demographic fluctuations that have to happen. But more importantly is that how do we really utilize these buildings the best way they know how to be used, and how they were intended to be used, and how do we get the buildings to that? And so this is where I talk about a live-attend analysis. Now I'm going to skip over the elementary in the middle because I think, that's kind of, first of all, it's easier to explain the high school because it's bigger and you can see it. But one of the impacts that when we look at enrollment is we look at what we call a live-attend analysis. And I think this is kind of when we work with task force, this is one of the most interesting and dynamic sheets that people use. But when we look at this, and I'm going to go across to Douglas in that white line right there and show you how to kind of read this sheet. As you go across right here on this line for Douglas, you can see that the total number of K-12 or the total number of 912 APS students which includes charter, that live in this boundary are 1,746. That's over to the right over there. That's how many APS charter students and fully enrolled APS students live in that boundary. But as I move across, of those, 1,250 of those 1,746 actually live and stay in the boundary to attend school. 117 leave the boundary to attend another boundary school. And then 379 leave to go to either a charter or to a specialty program school. And so what amounts to be about 30%, almost 30% of students actually leave the boundary to attend another APS school. Now, and you can go across and you can see where they attend. So for instance, 40 attend Mays High School, 34 attend Booker T. Washington, 55 attend the Best Academy, 190 go to KIPP Atlanta Collegiate. And so you can see the number. Now, if I were to look down on Douglas and the down column right here, I could see that 46 students actually leave another boundary and come into the boundary. And so you can see again, 7 come from Carver, 5 come from Maynard Jackson, 13 come from Washington. And so, and this unmatched number is oftentimes either students that actually maybe live outside the district, or we don't have an address match, we just have a student record for them. And so that's how this chart reads. And so as you look across, you can see, those boundaries that have kind of the biggest transfer rates in and out. Now I'm going to take you up to for instance, the middle school one, and you can see kind of across the board where middle schools actually have some that have really high transfer rates. If you look at like Young and, you go across to like Russell West, but you see these higher percentages. And then the elementary, I don't expect you to read this. You can actually pull this up on your computer in the state of the schools, and you can blow these numbers up, or you can even print this if you would needed to. If you print it and have access to 11 by 17 paper, that's probably best. But you can see school by school about where students live and where they attend their schools. And this is this year's data. So the next piece is the condition of buildings. This is actually the physical condition of buildings. Probably the most important thing about this is that the district goes through a 5-year cycle of analyzing their buildings from a physical condition standpoint. They hire a group called Parsons, and Parsons is a national reputable group that I work with I've worked with across the country, and I've seen across the country. And they've been doing it a long time. But the kind of what we look at here is that currently the district's condition of deferred maintenance. That means, systems that keep getting pushed back, even if they're at the end of their life or beyond their life cycle, but are still functional, ends up being about $672 million of things that need repaired. Now that sounds like a big number, well, and because it is a big number. But in a portfolio the size of Atlanta, that number ends up not being a big percentage of the overall portfolio of facilities. Now, however, when you're working in a long-range comprehensive plan, the idea is you either need to maintain or lessen that deferred percentage of deferred maintenance out there. And so there are ways to do that. And strategies that we use in a facilities planning process are that we can increase the funding. So when SPLOST funding becomes available, direct more dollars to that deferred maintenance. Or we could focus on just decreasing deferred maintenance by doing that. We could replace or comprehensively renovate older facilities that need those dollars. Or we could decrease the number of facilities that the district operates. And again, obviously that would decrease that number. But ultimately, what we need to do is we need to make sure that we are staying in front of that deferred maintenance dollar and not letting that kind of blow up to a large number that becomes an unattainable number in time. And so how that is calculated is that when Parsons assesses the buildings, they create what they call a facility condition index. That's this arrow right here. A facility condition index, or an FCI, is a repair cost versus a replacement cost of a facility. And then what we do with the score is that we've used the inverse of the score to come up with, so like in an FCA score, an FCI, what we know that you want to get closer to 100 in the FCA score. And so when you see scores on there for condition, 100 would be the best score and 0 would be the worst score on this. And so as you read the chart, you can see that. Now, things that we pay attention to also in condition when we're talking about things like renovation and replacement standards, first and foremost is that historic preservation conversation. Working with the Atlanta Preservation Center and collaborating with them on schools of 40 plus years old, but also putting criteria, understanding legacy and community significance. That is a really big piece of this plan is legacy. Understanding Atlanta's history. Knowing achievements by alumni and former faculty, architectural significance, historic preservation standards, and then putting those onto some classification. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that a historically significant building has to stay as a school, but can it stay, if a building is not going to be used in time, how can we use that building appropriately for community need out there and identify community needs, even if it's not going to be a school someday, in order to maintain that legacy and historical significance? But when you're looking at those renovation standards, things that we need to consider when it comes to renovation and replacement standards, besides the number, is we need to look at health and safety. That's first and foremost. Is a building able to be safe and healthy for students and parents and staff to work in and be involved in? Changing programmatic demands that are out there. Are those buildings meeting those program standards that we need? We also think about those emotional attachments and historic significance, but we also pay very close attention to geographic and logistic factors. And what I mean by that is that, even in an urban setting where there are certain drawn lines, some buildings are difficult to get through because of traffic patterns, because one thing that we'll pay attention to and we'll pay close attention to is walkability. Are we making schools to be more walkable and safe walk zones? Are we going to make decisions on facilities that kind of harm that? But we need to pay attention to that. Now, again, we have to pay attention to that when we get to the idea of those scenarios and options we're developing, or otherwise there's going to be a billion types of scenarios and rabbit holes we can go down. So we know that that's a part of what we need to talk about. And certainly funding, the big piece of funding about how much it costs to renovate versus replace facilities. Again, I'm not going to go through these in detail, but you can see the repair cost versus the replacement value of these schools and the FCA scores, by elementary type. And then I have another page on elementaries, and then we have also middle school facilities, and then we have high school facilities. And I think, again, keeping in mind that, the cost, what it costs today to work on school buildings has become just significantly higher than anything I could have possibly imagined even 10 years ago. But when you see some of these bigger numbers, like I think we got a question the other day about, so for instance, there's a school that had a significant amount of work in it. One of the high schools just not too long ago. I think it was, well, if I look at just Jackson in 2014, there's a pretty significant renovation of that building, but there's still almost $14 million in need. But remember, there's also 300,000 square feet out there. And so all those things kind of add up. Now, the most baseline thing that we could do for schools is to make them warm, safe, and dry, or in the South, it's cool, safe, and dry. Those are the most important factors, and safety being the primary, but also making sure that they are heated or cooled and they are dry to protect our students and staff. But that's only the baseline. If we want to programmatically get to where our building is going to get to, that's really important too. Now, the last thing I want to tell you about condition is that the way to plan for funding for a facilities plan is not to add up these total numbers. So it's not to look at the $134 million of repair costs for high schools and the 96 for middle schools and the, whatever the number is, 220 million for elementary schools. Because that's not the way. When you start to scope buildings, there are things that you might not be on the list for immediate replacement that you might replace, that have to scope together. And so the real funding comes in the planning part. These are indicators. And so as I wrap up kind of that piece of the data, when it comes to demographics and condition and capacity and utilization, what I want everybody to know is that it is never just one piece of data that drives the decision for facilities. It is never the indicator. And so I think that, things go out there like, oh, our building's being used at 50% utilization, so it's going to be closed. Well, what if it's a building that's really in the right location, that is in pretty good condition, but also has the right program spaces where it might be a building that we just need to use. We just got to figure out how to populate it better. And whether that's through rezoning, whether it's through program adjustments, whatever it is, that that is not the only indicator. The condition is not the only indicator. The demographic is not the only indicator. The program's not the only indicator. And so we want to make sure that comprehensively we're looking at all these things to help us make decisions. Now, as we get into the program side of this, which I think is a big part of this, is the integrated planning model. What we call the planning model is, trying to figure out how this district operates from the standpoint of the size of schools versus how much they cost versus the programs that are being offered. And at the end of the day, that's really what people want. They want the right size school with the right amount of programs, and they want the district to be efficient with their dollars. But what happens is that as a district works through this and there's a demand for, maybe smaller schools or whatever it is, or even smaller school size or class size, those are things that drive up cost. And so one of the things that we talk about a lot is that, like, if you want lower operating costs and you want robust program offerings, it is difficult to offer smaller school environments because there's simply not enough FTEs in the buildings. Now, currently, you do operate pretty significantly in the program side because you're spending a lot of money to supplant the small schools. But if a district wants robust programs and small school sizes, we're not gonna have low operations costs. If a district wants smaller schools and lower operating costs, then program offerings will suffer. Now, the trick of this is not that you have to choose one or the other. The trick of this is that every district's triangle looks a little different, and it's really driven by both a data set and that community vision for how schools should look. And so the idea behind this is that how do we get to the right school sizes at the right operations costs that still provide and have access for our students to have all the programs that are desired and needed out there to succeed. And so the first thing we talk about is school size. Again, school size is really determined about how much programming we get in the building, from a core programming to all those full liberal arts education of fine arts and physical education, exceptional education, and multilingual services, but also to have guidance counselors and enough administration and nursing staffs and media specialists and custodial and dietary staffs out there. So when we look at the elementary schools, the enrollment goal, the target goal for APS in this plan will be to look at, can we get, for every grade level, for every school, can we get at least 4 teachers per grade level in a school? Now, typically what that equates to is a school somewhere between 450 and 500 based on class size. The idea isn't to make schools bigger and class sizes get bigger. Keep in mind, school size and class size have no correlation together. Class size and the class size is an operational decision. I can have I can have the smallest school in the world, and I can still have the biggest class sizes, and that can work vice versa. But if we think in that term, that 30 of the 49 schools actually enroll fewer than 500 students, but 40 of the 49 can hold over 500. And so we see an inverse relationship of size. At the middle school, the target enrollment, I meant to change this actually. The target enrollment that we are looking for at the middle school is a minimum of 750 up to 1,500, because we know that schools can get that big for the middle school, for those fully funded. We know that those are direct links to the high schools. But keeping in mind that even if we're targeting that 750 to 1,500, there are 3 schools that enroll 240 to 450 kids. Now imagine a middle school with 240 kids in it and a program that has 900 kids in it. Those look vastly different from a program and access to program opportunity for students. And then for high schools, the real goal is to balance those program offerings and making sure that we are balancing that enrollment through good co-located programs and locations of programs, and really getting the programs to those high schools that are in most demand. Not high schools in most demand, but the programs of most demand into those high schools. And so we're really trying to target, how we get a good high school balance out there. These charts that I'm going to show you next really target kind of that minimum and maximum staffing. So in the state of Georgia, when we talk about a fully funded operationally school, we talk about the state of Georgia says that schools that operate under 450, the staffing goes to you get a principal and a half nurse, and that's what's funded by the state. Everything else that you see, the art teachers, the music teachers, the media specialists, the AP principals in there, the guidance counselors, actually come from local dollars. At the middle school, under 600, you see you're kind of in the same boat, including CTAE offerings. And then at the high school, under 1,000, you can see that high schools under 1,000, from a state perspective, the staffing formula and that goes down to the school districts is this. Now, which means that all these positions here end up getting locally funded, or they get funded by taking funds from fully staffed buildings and directing them over, or they get what they call a small school supplement in Atlanta Public Schools. Now, I know that in time, everybody understands that districts are facing budget crisis, and APS is not alone in that. They're fighting budget crisis too. And so when you start to see those budget crises, one of the things that they look at is how dollars are being spent. And this is one, because if I move to the next chart, you can see that when I get above 450, this is what the state can fund. Or when I get above 700, or when I get above 1,500, this is what the state dollars going in the building comes to. Now, once again, I want to share with you, it doesn't mean that schools under 450 or schools that are closing, or schools under 700 closing, or schools under 1,500 closing. That is not it at all. The idea is that how do we work to make sure that our schools can get maximize state dollars that are coming in the doors, and using the local dollars to enrich programs instead of trying to spread so thin across the district. So the programmatic framework, things we're going to be talking about this, and we're going to be talking a lot about early childhood and pre-kindergarten services. The district has a goal of universal pre-K, but how do we do that? How do we staff that? How do we house that? Career and technical and agriculture education is a big deal. We're gonna, one of the questions we're asking is about how we enhance this program, or do we need to make that school bigger, or dedicate a school to more of this kind of focused learning? Multilingual programs, signature programs, fine arts and athletics all play a role in how we make decisions as we go across. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in these. These are in your State of the Schools report. These are just where location of these programs are. These are the exceptional education courses and where they're located. The CTAE framework, the career and technical education and agriculture education. A couple of quick facts about this is that these CTAE programs are working, and the exposure to more students is going to be vital to more success. And again, we're not just talking the old school kind of career pathways. We're talking about, medical sciences. We're talking about technology sciences. We're talking about all those things that are pushing forward. And the CTAE group is working toward making sure that students are finding access to programs that are desirable and can get them jobs or career pathways as they move forward out of school, out of K-12 education. But I think one of the fascinating things about this is that over the past 5 years, 50 of APS's valedictorians, salutatorians, and STAR students came from the CTAE programs. And I think this can be attributed to making sure that these classes are really promoting more learning and more hands-on and applicable learning out there. And so how do we embrace that and build upon that? Again, this just gives you some idea of where they are in the high schools and all the programs being offered in the high schools out there, and the Career Academy, and then here's where they're being offered in the middle school. Obviously, this district has a goal of trying to push more exposure to CTAE exploration in the middle school. Middle school is about exploration, and exploration of CTAE programs is a real vital thing to be pressing into those middle schools. We'd also talk about charter schools and the impact of charter schools. Biggest thing here that I want to talk about is and we know that charters have played an important role in APS in the past, allowing for some diversity and choice out there. But one of the things that we have to note is that all the schools that are starred there in asterisks on the chart have about 3,500 students, and those schools all are in probationary status until June of 2027. Now, we don't know what's going to happen to those schools. It is not up to the facilities plan to decide what happens in 27. It's up to that probationary status what happens to those school buildings. But what it could mean is up to 3,500 students could return back to an APS building. Now, that means that we have to build a plan that has flexibility and the agility to be able to change and adapt to those out there. And so that's something that we need to keep paying attention to, and we need to build scenarios for just that. Our operational facilities is about right sizing facilities and making sure that we have the right number of facilities in the future, whether that means lower number in some areas or higher numbers in other areas. But really the thresholds that we need to determine are those capacity numbers and enrollment thresholds, really looking at those educational adequacy and physical condition of buildings, paying attention to geography, district-wide utilization, and most importantly, the programmatic impacts when it comes to how many facilities that are going to serve this district in time. Other operational strategies we look for are things in balancing enrollment. Do we make boundary adjustments? Do we make cluster feeder adjustments? Are they even effective? So when you move a boundary, is it even effective? Because people will just transfer out and go to the school they want to go to anyway. Are you not causing, through these kind of adjustments you're making, are you causing or not causing flight out of the district or flight to charter? On the condition level, what standards do we have to do to maintain that FCA for the years out there? And then finally, what are those renovation standards to consider, things like condition, age, and historical significance, to make good long-term decisions for facilities? And so just to kind of close, and I know that was a lot, but there's a lot of information to share, and we're going to narrow that down by cluster as we get further in. Your state of the schools reports do have information by cluster, more detailed versions of that. But what you need to know is that the first dates on here that we have were for May 8th, but August 5th and August 9th are days that are set to get back together. However, if you haven't received an email from Travis about optional dates, we are trying to get more dates in the summer to bring you in smaller groups so we can work with you more hands-on in your neighborhoods, to build this plan together from a cluster into a district level plan. We're planning those too. The public meetings, as we look at options and scenarios, the week of August 25th, and again, we put the week of August 25th because it may require several different types of meetings to go out there. The recommendations public meetings will come out in October, and then the first read for the board will be in November. And it says November 10th, but I think between the first and second read, we're gonna have those public meetings also. The planning framework for the Board of Education, you see this, that these are those public meetings. Our first read is going to be the November board meeting. I think the November board meeting right now is a little flexible because of the election date in November, and then which will drive that December board meeting, which they'll get on the calendar, and we'll follow that. So with that, I'm going to stop and sharing. And I see we have a couple of questions in there. Again, first and foremost, I want to thank you for your patience and just listening to all that and hearing all that, because there's a lot of information there. But you can imagine there's a lot of information to kind of sift through. Ultimately, when we do facilities planning, it's really important that there's a lot of information coming at us in this, a lot of data coming at us, a lot of community vision and stuff comes at us. And what I try to share with people is that to build a really strong, comprehensive facilities plan, you have to work with data, and you have to work with that community vision too. But I will tell you what can happen in a plan is that if you pay too much attention to the data, you could ignore that community needed vision. But if you pay too much attention to that community needed vision, you could ignore data. And so the art to good planning is that how does that combine? And it's district by district. Every district is different in this. You're different than Fulton, you're different than DeKalb, you're different than anybody around you. You are APS, you are Atlanta Public Schools. And how does that shape this? And again, we can't ignore the data, but we also can't ignore that community vision. And I think working with this task force to kind of shape how those work together will be the key to the success of this. So that's where I'll kind of stop. now, and then if there's, I think, Kavi, do you want to kind of facilitate kind of the questions?
Yeah, so since we have only a few people, if you have any questions, concerns, or comments, this is the time.
Okay.
Any question about the process, methodology, or data, or meetings and content and website, anything. So
And we are, I mean, we are always available. Like, you get communications. You've probably seen communications from Matthew Sachs. He's from our group. And you see communications from Travis Norville a lot. Those are people you can contact with questions or comments or things that are going on out there. We do want to hear from you, and we know your time is valuable. And we can't tell you how much we appreciate your efforts in helping us go through this plan together.
Hey, good afternoon. I have a quick question.
Sure.
So it sounds as if the overarching goal is, as far as this task force is concerned, and correct me if I'm wrong, is to, again, assess all of the data, what the data says, what the community wants, in projecting what we may need to do for our individual clusters a year or two down the road. So with this task force, is one of our tasks, would it be coming up with suggestions on what we need to do in these individual clusters? Like what's the overarching goal?
Mm-hmm. So that is the first step in this one for the task force, because as we start to work in your clusters, I mean, because you live in those clusters, you live in those school buildings, you see those challenges and opportunities that you have in your cluster. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we build those up, and so actually, when we get the clusters together, we're going to be grouping you together anyway. We might not be working like all three together, but there'll be like 3 clusters in the room, and they're all probably adjacent or working together too to figure out how we build that together. Because there are possibilities where schools kind of sit on borderlines and they could impact decisions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first goal. But the bigger goal is to help us kind of as we build to a longer range comprehensive plan about how this district is shaped from a facility standpoint. We want you to help us build that vision too, and that will come in time. It's kind of an iterative process. Let's get from the cluster to the larger clusters to the district level, and then let's talk about, because I think that we also, and I didn't mention this and I'm glad you said this, we're asking for like people on this task force to even be part of a sub-task force for things like career and technical education, performing arts center.
Right.
We want guidance on those kind of things too. And so there's a lot of parts that, but ultimately, yes, build the cluster level information with us, help us build it into a larger district plan so we can get buy-in from the ground up in the
Gotcha.
plan.
Okay.
So thanks for that question.
Mm-hmm.
anyone else?
So I have a utilization question, and I
Sure.
think I heard you. Good evening, everyone. I think I heard you when you were speaking with the example that you gave, like if there was a program in the school and they decided to move the program to another school based on the utilization and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a newsie and I watch a lot of news and so
Yeah.
forth. And I watch a lot of whether it's in this district or some other district or whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, and I'm using this and I'm not special education, but I'm just using that as an example.
Yeah.
If there was a special education program in a school, and I think this may be a Fulton County situation where I may have saw it recently,
Mm-hmm.
where they moved a special education program from a school to another school within the district.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just thinking about this and I'm hoping it's under this utilization piece that you were talking about. And therefore that utilization piece was no longer in that school
Mm-hmm.
for those students that was in special education.
Right.
So my question therefore becomes, since it was no longer being utilized in that building, with the district then, if we do the same thing within our building, when we look at the demographics and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
based on where that school may be, when those schools were zoned, those parents were zoned in that original school, would the district then be responsible? Because I'm thinking in terms of transportation.
Yep,
I'm
yep.
thinking in terms of making sure that those students that were in that school being placed in another school that may be location wise further away
Mm-hmm.
to the note that the location that they would be responsible for making sure that those students are being transported to that school without the parents being responsible for it.
Yeah,
Because in this situation, the district did not do that.
right. So a couple things on that, because there's a kind of a lot of layers to that onion to unpeel here. First and foremost, I think that what I'm afraid happens in school districts, like special education especially, is that I think sometimes special education gets moved around because a school has capacity and for no other reason, right? Um, that's not going to be the case in this plan. We don't move kids just because there's room in a building. If it's we want to be programmatically sound in this. And so moving students to in like exceptional programs like special education, we would be intentional about movement that would go to space that's appropriate to that student. Now, typically, if you've got a program of that kind of magnitude, those students are typically transported anyway. And so, but when we're talking about like if we move boundary lines or and possibly if there's consolidations out there, what happens to the transportation of those kids? Well, there are district policy around certainly around distance to school, but there's also policy around safety zones, things like railroad tracks, highways, dangerous intersections, those kind of things that if those occur, students get transportation anyway. There are instances that also when we make those moves, there are students that are actually closer to the school we're moving to than further away. And so we pay attention to that. So any movement like that, certainly when transportation is necessary because of all those things, the district provides. And so and that's why we have to be real conscious of this, because we want to make sure that we're not taking away walkability if we don't have to, right? And I think that's important. And that we're also just not moving programs for capacity reasons, or we're just not moving kids because of capacity reasons. We're moving kids because stronger programmatic reasons, they have the right spaces, a better building, a healthier building, a safer building. Those are reasons we want to move kids. But transportation will always, so one of the key people but departments that sit when we go into that options kind of phase is transportation, because they have to inform us along the whole way. So and I appreciate you thinking like that, because that, I mean, it just shows that I know what you're thinking about. You want to make sure those kids are taken care of if they get moved, and I'm with you. We got to make sure that happens. Yeah. Rhonda, you're muted real quick.
You are
Rhonda, oh, there you go.
I appreciate you responding to that because, like I say, I'm not special education, but I do
Yeah.
see a lot of things on the news. And
Mhm.
as an educator, I thought about that with
Mhm.
that comment that you made.
Yeah, that is, special education one's an easy one to kind of talk about because it happens so much out there. I'm afraid it happens too much for the wrong reason.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, Miss Nunley, you get your hand up.
Hi,
Hey.
I thank you so much for your time on the Zoom call. I just want to say this is a lot of rich information. Last time we went through this process, was I believe it was 2023, with Dr. Herring. And what I remember about these public meetings on my side of town, I'm in the Carver cluster, was the master plan team or the consulting team didn't feel like the parents and I, that we just didn't feel like they came with a plan for, they were demographers and data sets. And that was one thing, but in our neighborhoods, we also needed this other human approach that was more, I don't know if the word is anthropological, like that
Sure.
just really connect to the human side of this thing.
Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
what I felt happened last time that really crushed a lot of rich discussion was people came with data and became demographers and
Mhm.
forgot the audience they were talking to And I would
Yep.
say I remember sitting in Dunbar Recreational Center or the elementary school over there. Well, Dunbar Recreation and the school that connects to it, I forget, but what's the name of that school? Mechanicsville. Anywho, it was in Mechanicsville. And I just remember a parent getting up who's also a cafeteria worker. And then one that got up that was a bus driver for Atlanta Public Schools. And I just saw it on their face. They were like, I don't care about these numbers. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
tell me about my child and like why they've been in this IB program and you're trying to take them out.
Yep.
And they have already established patterns in their feeder pattern and the programming that exists, and you're ripping them away. And it just didn't address this element of humanity. And so
Yep.
I charged us in this space because that's how I feel right now. And I'm a person with like knowledge and formal education to manage data systems and understand them at high levels. But
Yep.
I just challenge this body of people to think about how we're going to be intentional about that space, because this information was rich for me and I'm going to mine through it. I think about the summer offerings and I'm going to do the survey and share what best times to work for me and our community and get the community engaged and asking them about what times work. But yeah, that's just my 2 cents. And if y'all have ways y'all are thinking about the other side of this thing that's qualitative, then let's brainstorm what that looks like and who are rich captains or I call them like street level agents of change in the neighborhood, and how we get those people out to spread the word and to help this data become more lay. Thank you.
Yep. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate that comment. I think that, one of the reasons we start in the process with a community for task force like this is that's exactly that knowing that kind of neighborhood by neighborhood and school by school, that look, it's not easy from a data perspective to see. And that's fair. But we also, I mean, again, what I think about in this process too is that, sometimes what we think as, kind of fair is really unfair. Like, I think that, I go in districts all the time where, students are in buildings that have, 150 kids in them, and they don't have any sort of arts, they don't have any music, they don't have a guidance counselor in there because they just can't have them. And that's not fair, but they think, well, I just want my small school. But then they go into middle school with 1,000 kids in it, and they can't handle kind of that magnitude. And so it is a balance of trying to understand that personal side of this, and making sure that, look, it sounds real simple, but the first rule of planning should be an easy rule: do no harm, right? And when you talk about things like that, those come to heart for me. That I want to make sure that that's why we have to go deeper into some of these communities. And there might be some that we don't have to go so deep into, but there are communities that we're going to have to do a deeper dive into to really understand the impacts of those decisions that get made in time. And when impacts do get made, help people understand that, okay, this is what you're going to walk into, not that just go walk into that. And so thank you for that. And thank you for sharing that.
Malone, if you do not have any more questions, I posted a link to the survey in the chat, and then it is very, very important that you take the survey and then you make sure everybody in your community, all the parents that also take the survey, because the responses we get from the survey is kind of